first of all, just to welcome everyone along. Thanks for coming along to this. My name is Phil Dickens. I'm a member of PCS and a rep on the National Executive Committee. I've organised this in the capacity of PCS's Rank File Network. It's a group of workers and activists within the union who are trying to promote more rank and file organising and get people thinking about more innovative ways of getting more workers actively involved in the union and pushing and leading from the front. We've done a few of these meetings where we've talked about different topics, which you can find on our YouTube channel. But this one today, we are talking about the use of technology and how unions can, I think, do it better. Is probably a fair summation there. So we've got Stuart Melvin with us, who is going to talk about that. He's going to give a bit of a presentation. So the way this is going to work, he's going to talk for a bit, and then once he's done, we'll open it up, and then obviously people can put their hands up if you want to ask any questions, or as I said earlier, if you don't feel comfortable talking, you can put stuff in the chat as well, and we'll answer questions that way. Because it is being recorded, anyone who doesn't want the face to appear on the screen, just turn your camera off. That's fine. And if you don't want your voice to appear either, then it's probably better to put the question in the chat. But with all that said, I will hand over to Stu to kick us off.
Thanks, Phil. Hi, everyone. Yeah, really big pleasure to be talking to you today, and thanks for coming along. Really appreciate your time on what, at least in my area, is a nice sunny Saturday. So yeah, we're going to be talking a little bit about obviously unions organising with technology. I'm just going to get my my presentation set up. Hopefully, you can all see my screen at this point. So obviously, yes, we've built this as unions organising with technology. We put in the blurb a little bit here about what we could learn from some of the other social movements that are sort of making headlines or making waves around the world at the moment. I want to just say a little bit about myself, just to introduce myself. So I first came in, I should say, as it says at the bottom there, I'm not a techie. I'm not an IT person. I'm foremost an organiser. I came into activism in my mid-teens a little while ago now, as part of the Alter Globalisation and anti-capitalist movements around that time. I later became a union organiser. So I was an organiser both in a voluntary capacity with the IWW. I was a lay rep and activist with USDOR. And then I was a paid full-time union organiser with Unison for 4 or 5 years, working in amongst private contractors, schools and colleges as well, care homes. I then later was a co-founder and national organiser at Acorn, which is a tenant and community union, started in Bristol, but now a national organisation. Did that for 4 or 5 years. And then the last couple of years, I've been working as a climate justice organiser for one of the big environmental NGOs. And as I say, during that time, I've come to technology as a means to strengthen and augment organising rather than the other way around. And I've had to pick it up as I go along. And as it so happens, I think one of the best things we can take about technology and organising is to use tools that are accessible, tools that are simple and that work for the mass majority of people. So that this is about organising, not hyper slick technology or anything like that. So we're going to have a quick look at what unions are currently doing, and I'm going to ask you your sort of opinions. So feel free, please do pop in the chat box. It'd be really interesting to see what you think. What does typical or good? And I've said, we should start with what does good organising look like in a trade union context. I'm not sure how typical that is. But yeah, it'd be really interesting to see what you guys think good organising looks like at the moment. What is a typical or good organising process in a trade union context, in a workplace context? Feel free to pop in. What does anyone think? How do you first start an organising drive in a workplace? Talking to people. Yeah, Yeah, fundamentally, that's absolutely probably the, you know, I've heard it called the organiser's secret weapon, the one-to-one, the typically having a conversation with people is a really, really big part of the whole game. Before we get to that point, we need to think about what it is we're organising. What's the structure? What's the you know, workplace or community? Yeah, absolutely. Building relationships, mapping the workplace. Yeah, all of these things. Yeah. So first of all, we might identify a structure. We might say, well, you know, we're going to organise this particular workplace, or we're going to organise this employer or this community or something like that. We have to bound it. We have to say, you know, who is the constituency that we're organising and who isn't. Mapping, Melissa put in the workplace. So yeah, basic research, basically figuring out, you know, what are the different groups. So whether that's teams or departments or offices or sites, who is already in the union, who isn't, what level of support people might have for the organisation or for what we're doing. So yeah, beginning to map all of that out. And then as was said earlier, talking to people. We typically do one-to-one conversations. These are intentional conversations. They are conversations where they're normally at least trying to be a relatively deep and long conversation, sort of 45 minutes, something like that is fairly typical. Of not only, sometimes they are more investigatory, finding out what issues people care about, etc. Sometimes they are more persuasive and agitational, trying to help people realize their own frustrations or anger or any of these things to move them into action. Through that, we identify key issues, things that will hopefully unite the constituency that we're trying to organise. And we also identify potential leaders. We identify people that are, and this we'll come back to this point actually. We identify two types of leader, I think. We identify people who are passionate about the issue or passionate about the union, typically what you might call activists or potential activists. And we also identify people who are what Jane McAlevey calls organic leaders, people that are influential in the workplace. Sometimes they're the same people, but most often they are not. And we have a lot of work to do often to engage the organic leaders in order to influence their co-workers to come behind the union, etc., or come into the union. So we identify leaders. Hopefully through that we build an organising committee, which is obviously a committee of leaders, and we normally, you know, might vary union to union, but presumably we provide some training, some support to those people and take them through the rest of the process. They hopefully, if we're doing this right, they begin to take over. They take on the role of doing the one-to-ones and continuing the mapping, and continuing the issue ID and things like that. Yeah, they begin to take the lead and take ownership of the process. And generally, again, it varies, but hopefully we move to some forms of collective action. Collective action meaning, again, in certain terminology, we might talk about structure tests. So we might talk about different types of action as testing where we've got to, obviously pushing our agenda that's been developed by the organising committee, and beginning to bring hopefully a majority of workers into action to the point where we can, you know, either win the campaign that they've agreed, get to the point of being able to mobilise industrial action if necessary, and being able to win a recognition agreement, or in the US a contract. So that's typically what I think, you know, most of us would recognise as a relatively typical or good organising process. If you've got any other additions to that, or anything you think isn't quite right there, you know, again, it's all up for debate. I think, you know, part of the thing here is that there is no perfect organising model, and we change it according to the terrain that we find ourselves on. So yeah, do pop those in the chat box. Keep adding in. So if that's a typical union organising approach, what is a typical union use of technology? Again, I'd really love to hear your thoughts on this one. So in the chat box, what are the best, what are the worst ways that particularly UK unions are using technology at the moment? Would love to hear what your thoughts are. Obviously, I'll put in some. So who's got familiar with Zoom calls? I'm imagining, yeah, engaging with workers on Zoom and Facebook. Yeah, interesting. WhatsApp, yeah, exactly. Anything else that people have thought? Zoom calls have obviously, I guess maybe 18 months ago, not too many people had used Zoom. And now it feels like, literally everyone, like all of my family, it doesn't matter on the age group, everyone's on Zoom. Zoom quizzes played a role for what, 6 months, and then we all got fed up with them, etc. So yeah, everybody's used Zoom calls now. And I know that, one of the, there are some positive lessons coming out already, it feels a weird thing to say about something that's been such a horrific tragedy. But we have seen some positives coming out of our experience during the pandemic. And one of those, I think, is, actually, we might hate them sometimes, but Zoom calls have been really, really accessible for a lot of people that might not always find union meetings accessible. And, we've seen particularly folk that, maybe are carers, parents, disabled, etc., have found that they can engage with the union in a way that they weren't previously able to. So what else have we got in the chat box? Yeah, we've got some old-fashioned posts. Yeah, absolutely. Membership registration. Yeah, online joining forms. Some of the worst ways, thinking that a good social media page will make people join. So replacing traditional organising. Yeah, these things are things that have happened. Definitely for at least the last 10 years-ish, maybe a bit more than that. Most unions have had an online join form, and most unions have engaged in some form of marketing, probably from the sort of mid-90s onwards, really, but definitely in the last 10, 15 years. That marketing takes the form, obviously, of like more traditional marketing, so things like TV adverts or newspaper adverts, but it also takes the form of social media advertising, both paid social media advertising, and also, of course, just building what they aim to be as a good Facebook presence or a good Twitter presence, and having organic reach on their social media. Yeah, so that's interesting. So from Phil, PCS has an app to access membership records and record conversations, structure tests, leads, etc. So this is relatively rare. Most unions in the UK aren't currently using an app like that, but some are. So that in itself is, I think, been a, there's pros and cons to it again, and it can be done well or it can be done badly, but it is kind of a step forwards in some ways. Petitions, yeah, we've got polls, we've got petitions. Email lists, yeah, of course, most unions have email lists. So most unions have got a website. Most unions to some degree have run like surveys or petitions online. Some unions have gone as far as using more specialist, I suppose, digital mobilization or digital campaigning tool sets, things like Action Network. So as well as the more basic use of websites, if you take something like the NEU School Cuts campaign going back 2017, I guess, you had a website which was a dedicated website which helped people find out how much was due to be cut from their school budget, allowed them to share that information on social media, which built a massive outcry of people upset about that. They also used a tool called Action Network, which is a digital mobilization tool set. It's a pretty good one. It's basically free. There is a paid version, but it's not super loads of money, and it is pretty usable. Allows people to do petitions, forms, events online, etc., etc. They use that to engage mostly parent and school worker networks at a local level in campaign activity and in communicating with people. And that campaign worked really, really well. We saw something like 10% of voters credited it with influencing the way they voted at a general election. And yeah, Tazy says there, IWGB use Action Network. So other people there have said online chat. We've got a WhatsApp group for members. So people talk about issues as soon as they come up. So in some ways, although this is like really simple tech, in some ways, this is the holy grail. This is beginning to say, well, tech is not just about broadcasting a message out to the workforce or to potential members or whatever, like marketing style. Tech is an opportunity to build a community. It's an opportunity to let people talk to each other, to share anger or frustrations, to raise issues, etc., and even to talk about what you're going to do about it. So yeah, WhatsApp groups are on there, Facebook groups very similar, and other similar kind of peer-to-peer conversational models. So we are starting to see that generally, I think, correct me if I'm wrong in the chat box, but generally I think that latter aspect of it tends to come from the bottom up. It tends to be union activists or a branch creating WhatsApp groups for themselves, rather than a sort of intentional strategy from the national union. But I might be wrong on that. I know that the CWU made excellent use of WhatsApp groups during their campaigns about a year and a half back to win national ballots and beat the threshold, which they did do, and then obviously came up against legal injunctions which stopped them taking action anyway, which is a whole separate debate and discussion. But the use of WhatsApp groups, yeah, absolutely, really powerful as a means of connecting workers together. It was actually our paid organiser that set it up, and we're CWU. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, it's fairly rare. You're right, fairly rare. So that's kind of how unions are using tech. So we've seen, as I say, mostly a kind of marketing approach, a little bit of beginning to use technology to connect members together and let people talk to each other. That's about as far as it's gone. There's a few other rare kind of instances and a few apps, and obviously online you've got TUC sponsored things like the Work Smart app and the Union Finder tool. I asked on Facebook, on my Facebook yesterday, some of you I think are on there, what are the best and worst examples of union tech, and there wasn't too much love for Union Finder. That was pretty universally seen as a tool that didn't work, which is a real problem. We've got this situation where perhaps if most people are searching for what union should I join online, the first thing they might come across if they Google that is to go to the Union Finder tool, and it basically doesn't work. It basically doesn't find the union that you should join. That's really interesting. Steve's just posted in the chat box that there was an official Facebook group for the PCS, but it was too difficult and resource intensive to manage. And then, yeah, that was suspended. So members and reps created their own groups. Great to see workers getting stuck in, but it removes the union leadership, which makes them less likely to see what members are saying on the day-to-day basis. So yeah, again, real interesting pros and cons. And I think, one of the things about these, about the use of tech and things like Facebook groups and WhatsApp groups and stuff is that it's been, I think a lot of organizations typically see it as being a light touch thing and not really needing to do much work for it. And actually it's really not true. If you're going to use it effectively, there's going to be a lot of time and investment put into running those things. So, okay, so that's how unions are doing things. There's a couple of other things that I'd just like to mention, which are in the kind of union or worker organising sphere. One is the Organise platform. I think it's organise.network, if you search for it. This was set up by a former staff person at 38 Degrees, a petition-based website, campaigning website. And the idea here is that you can start your own petition as a worker. That was the initial sell for the website. They then moved into setting up employer networks so that people from the same employer could talk to each other. And they have done a lot of surveys. You can now run your own surveys, but they also survey 10% of the people on their email list. Every time you sign a petition, you join their email list. They survey 10% on what to focus on, and then they run central campaigns as well as letting you start your own campaigns. They remarket their campaigns, obviously, to their existing email list as well as a way of building them and spreading them. They have also, just in the last couple of months, I think, moved to allow paid, so donating members of the platform to access workplace advice and support. So, really interesting in terms of like, where does this rub up against what a trade union is? And this is I think the minimum is kind of £1 a month, that kind of thing. The support is obviously much less than what a union can provide, but it is interesting that they're moving into that model now. Through that platform, they've engaged more than 1 million workers in 4 years, and I think somewhere in the region of a third of that has happened during the coronavirus crisis. But that is a lot of workers obviously engaged, not organised. I don't want to in any way suggest that signing a petition is in any way an organising thing, but they have that means of communicating now with, as I say, over 1 million workers inside 4 years. The other thing I'll just mention is a tool. This is similar to what Phil, well, perhaps it's similar. I don't know, Phil. I'd be interested to know how similar. That Phil mentioned earlier, an app for organising, basically. So this one that I'm showing you here is Action Builder. This has been created by the same people who made Action Network. This is at the moment US only. It's very difficult to make these things compliant with UK and European data protection law. The guys at Action Network are quoting about 50 grand to make that happen. If any unions want to help make that happen, give me a shout, because I'm keen to see it happen. But basically, this is an app which is mobile first, so you'd have it on your phone. You can see all of the sites that you're organising. You can then zoom into them and see how many people are already at different levels, whether they are activists, whether they are members, whether they're supporters. You can customize all that. They say that assessments is one of the features there, so you can assess whether people are, you know, on the fence, or whether they're highly supportive or really opposed to the union, so that you know who you need to talk to more, etc. You have a wall chart version of that, and you know, you can upload and export data from it, and of course you can assign tasks. So you can give your not just staff but your volunteer organisers access to this tool with different permission levels, and assign tasks. So, you know, talk to these 10 workers, or make phone calls to these 20 workers, or whatever it is, and have people involved in the campaign in that way. So interesting tool set. It has been used really well. There are unions and work sites over in the US that have organised through using this tool. They have some case studies on their website, or on their Medium blog, I think, linked to from their website, which are worth having a look through. At the moment, apart from bespoke tools like what unions have created themselves, so like at PCS, we don't have anything like this in the UK. I am talking to some tech companies as well about whether we can produce a UK sort of version of this. So again, if you're interested in being involved with that, reach out to me. So that's one way where unions have taken the use of tech further and turned it into, I suppose, what we might more reasonably recognise as real organising, as real workplace organising. So what are social movement organisations doing? Well, I said at the beginning that I'm not a techie, I'm an organiser. And one of the things about this is that in many ways, large scale, fast scaling social movements have been using many of the same tools, but just using them in a different way. And it's more about your approach to organising and the way you think about augmenting and replicating traditional union organising through technology, rather than using a piece of technology that's going to, you know, particularly save the day or solve your problems. So if we think about what the big social movements that I'm talking about, I guess we're thinking about things like Extinction Rebellion, thinking about things like Black Lives Matter. Over in the US, we're thinking about things like the Sunrise Movement, Movimiento Caseca, as well as the electoral movements around, well, partly around Jeremy Corbyn, partly around Bernie Sanders' campaign. All of these and others, all of these and other social movements in recent years have been using a form of organising that has come to be known as one of these things. These are they are slightly different things, but they are more or less very similar approaches to mass scale organising. So things called big organising, aka momentum driven, swarm, or distributed organising models. Who knows what they look like? Has anyone got any sort of thoughts or experience on using those kind of models? And if you do, what are the processes and factors at play in those models? Again, interested if you want to pop those in the chat box. The first of them is structure. These organizations typically put up front an accessible, replicable, and best practice structure. So all organizations have a structure, trade unions have a structure, and it's relatively, can be more or less opaque, but relatively clear what that is in terms of joining a branch and potentially being involved in, you know, some kind of regional council or industrial council or something like that. But what these organizations are focused on really is a combination of local, very, very local groups, so that you can get together with 3 or 4 people in your community, or you know, your school, your campus, your workplace, whatever. They have guidance in place for how those things work. They make them as participatory as possible, which is a little bit different, I think, to some of our trade unions, typically very a little bit more formal, for good reason. I'm not saying there's a negative to that, but they will make them easily replicable so that people can easily start a new one. And when I say easily, I mean within a few days. So not within within months or even many weeks in the case of trade unions. To set up a new branch, it can be months and months and months. These organisations will let you set those up within days through a process of making them replicable. The second thing is a clear story, clear and compelling story of goals and morals. So what is the big fight? What is the big thing that we're fighting for? Why does it matter so much? What's the big thing that we're going to achieve if you take the action we're asking you to take? So really communicating that in a way where everyone is very, very mission focused. Everyone is working towards the same ends. People feel part of something big, something ambitious and achievable. I say big and ambitious rather than big and achievable. The third component is the strategy. So a clear and convincing strategy of what to do and why. So this is the thing that makes people feel like, although that thing is really big and really ambitious, it is achievable because there's this clear answer to what we're going to do and why we're going to do it and how that's going to work. There's a theory of change there. So the structure, the story, and the strategy are used in a way where they reinforce each other. They are integrated together as a means of spreading, organizing very, very quickly. In practice, what does this look like? It often looks like a polarizing or inspiring action, which drives engagement. It basically forces people to ask themselves a question: do I support this or am I against it? And those people that are supportive find themselves reaching out to the organization, and the organization then, is engaged with them. So this is the stuff that really happens online. When you see Extinction Rebellion take a mass action, so for example, Extinction Rebellion took their first mass action at about 1,000 people in Parliament Square. And that was enough people. They blocked some roads and they captured enough headlines and enough social media energy to see a lot more people sign up online. When people signed up online, they went through this fast digital absorption process. So whereas with a union, again, you might be able to join the union online, but it's typically going to be a very slow process before you find out who your rep is or who your officer is. If you sign up as a rep, it could be months before you take a training course or do any casework or any of that kind of thing. In something like Extinction Rebellion's case, between their first action and their second action, they went from 1,000 people on the first action to 6,000 people on the second action. And that was about 2 weeks later, 2.5, 3 weeks later. And that was a result of a very fast digital absorption process. So that process looked like a stock of resources they would give you. Training was the real key thing. Training, which was very, very quick for you to access. You would be able to go on to either an online or a real world direct action civil disobedience training that would teach you how to build your little group, how to participate in the action that was coming up. So very, very fast, mostly online. But the whole point is going from online to offline. So the replication is also done via training, coaching, a leadership structure and resources. So again, you might, as I say, come in as a new activist. Say you want to start a group, you will go through maybe a direct action. They do a kind of induction training. I think it's had different names at different points, but they do a training which is just teaching you the DNA of the movement. So that story, that structure, and that strategy. That's as a means of keeping everything focused while it replicates so quickly. So it's helping people to understand what that movement has at its core, at its fundamentals. They have then, as well as the local group structure, you have national or international volunteer teams who provide all kinds of work. They do the induction work, they do coaching, they help manage and do check-ins and do well-being work, and they support activists at a local level and all kinds of stuff. And then, of course, you've also got a suite of online resources, simple things, Google Docs that tell you how your group could be structured, best practice for running meetings, how to organize an action, etc., etc. Everything that somebody needs to know to participate in one of these movements is laid out through that training, coaching, and resources. So again, it's not that we in the unions don't do these things. We do to a degree. We obviously do have courses that teach people how the union works, that teach people how to be a rep, but it's much, much slower. And it is not done in such an integrated and intentional way. We don't typically run mass actions as a means not only to push our agenda, but also to engage a ton more people, and then very quickly absorb them, train them, and unleash them to carry on and do the next wave of action. There's not that kind of constant cyclical approach to it. So in Extinction Rebellions, we're just going to look at a couple more of the cases of where these things have been working and what kind of tools they're using. So Extinction Rebellion's case, as I say, mass action, absorption, training, and then mass action again. The tools that they use, and this is, like I said right at the beginning, my preference here, and I think what we're seeing through these movements, is a reliance on the most accessible tools possible. So there's no digital tool that is completely accessible. For various reasons, people might struggle to use and access digital tools, but they are using things which are in the consumer tech sphere. So this is not bespoke. This is not stuff they've created themselves for the most part. It's not particularly expensive. So they're using things like Google Docs for all of their resources. They use a tool called, or I think they've moved off of it now actually, but originally used a tool called Basecamp, which was more a space for their volunteers to talk to each other and plan their activity. And they've used Action Network, which I mentioned earlier. They use Action Network for sign-up forms. Because it's free, you can distribute it out to local groups and let them create their own sign-up forms and things like that, and help them to put in place, again, a quick absorption and turnaround process for getting people active. What are some of the other movements that have done this? So Sunrise movement. Sunrise is a youth-led movement in the United States, fighting for a Green New Deal, for good green jobs and climate justice. And again, they've done very, very similar. This action here, they staged some large-scale actions, occupying political locations, offices of major politicians. They did that in a very disciplined way, as you can see here. They're all wearing the kind of uniform of the movement. They've all got their signs, etc. There were well planned out chants, etc. So it was very media savvy, social media savvy particularly. So through doing that action, they got a lot of attention and were able to absorb a lot more people. Again, training and coaching played a key role, and then they would turn people out for the next action. So what kind of tools were they using? Again, Google Docs and Google Forms was a major part of this. For instance, if you wanted to form a Sunrise group, they call them a hub. Any 3 people can form a Sunrise group, and you sign up on a Google form. That triggers an email to one of their support teams at a national level, who will reach out, have a conversation with you, give you the resources and the induction that you need, and then you can crack on and build your group very, very quick. Again, they used Action Network for other forms of online action for signups. They used Slack, which is came out of the technology, like tech company sphere. It's again a sort of messaging app. It's become fairly widely known. Some of you might have seen it. Again, like all these tools, people have a kind of love-hate relationship with it, but basically it allows different teams to have like private messaging and channel-based messaging within their team, as well as being able to communicate across the whole organization. Again, it's free. There is a paid version, but you don't need it. You can use the free version. And then more recently, during the last presidential election that Joe Biden's just won, Sunrise used a phone banking platform. So one of these, something like Call Hub or Zetkin. There's a few others out there. I can share a bunch after this call when Phil sends out sort of follow-up emails for phone banking. But again, the interesting thing is not so much the tech that they've used, but more how they've used it. So, for example, the Sunrise movement, when the election started recently, they had one paid organizer, only one paid organizer on this particular aspect of their operation, and they were saying, well, how can what we want to do? They set themselves a goal of, I think, reaching 300,000 people by phone calls to get them to vote Democrat in the election. They said, well, we could do this in a fairly traditional way with a staff member leading it, or we could set the staff member the task of building national volunteer teams who would then actually recruit and manage thousands of other volunteers. And that's what they did. They ended up with just 50 volunteers in 6 to 8 national teams. They would they had a bunch of best practice, and again, I can send you information like this. There's some really best practice stuff on how to form good teams, in terms of what a good team needs to work, what size it should be, etc., etc. If it got to more than about, well, in fact, if it got more than single figures in the team, so 9 people, they would split it into 2 teams, and they had all kinds. They broke the whole project down into really small chunks. So they had teams not only doing induction, but they had teams just doing, as I say, well-being check-ins with volunteers, doing the data uploads that came out of the phone calls, etc., etc. All of these teams were interdependent. They all relied on each other, but they all had their own piece of the pie and were all doing their work. And again, they were organized on, I think, on Slack. It certainly could do on Slack. There's other tools you could use, so that they could all talk to each other. They all knew what was going on. And through this, they made 3.2 million phone calls. So that's the equivalent of phoning roughly 50% of every union member in the UK. There's nothing to stop us doing that. Imagine how many more reps we could get. Imagine how much more activism we could stir up through making those calls with 50 volunteers in the first place. The key things, going back to what I was saying a minute ago, though, about the story and the strategy, that would all need to be really compelling. People would need to know why they were doing it and how it was contributing to a bigger goal. So where's it been seen in the worker organising context? Probably the best example is the Red for Ed movement in the United States. These were educators. It's been called teacher strikes, but really it was one of its sort of key components was that it wasn't siloed like that. It wasn't purely teachers. It was educators and all public sector workers. And the way that this movement scaled was really quite incredible. They again, they had a clear and compelling kind of cause at the beginning. So they had situations with healthcare their access to healthcare being made worse. But it obviously led to an upsurge where people said, well, actually our schools are underfunded in general, our pay is appalling. And generally, like any good organizer knows, it really, all of these issues were stand-ins for respect, for dignity, for having dignity in your work, dignity in your labor. So what they did was, these were in states where strikes were illegal initially, and the unions weren't doing a great deal. The unions were very, very demobilized, a little bit like maybe in healthcare here in the UK, where although we have large paper membership, it's fairly disorganized, fairly demobilized. They set up Facebook groups. The Facebook groups scaled very, very quickly. They went from obviously nothing to a few hundred to a few thousand to tens of thousands inside a few weeks or just a couple of months. And part of the way that happened again is that by getting a few people into the Facebook group in the first place, they would then take some action. So even if just 5 people would go to a public hearing about the medical, the healthcare situation, they would, ask some really awkward questions and stir things up and do things that would look good on social media, basically. It would get shared back into the group. It would inspire more people to say, hey, that looked amazing. I want to, how can I be involved? What can I do? So they would then go through absorption, training, and then turn people out as organisers. They ended up with, I can't remember exactly how much, it might have been 20,000, what they called, what were effectively school-based organisers that they trained and unleashed through these Facebook groups. And they took a fairly traditional organising model that we explained right at the beginning in terms of like doing one-to-ones and doing structure tests, etc. And they ended up unleashing the biggest wave of industrial action in the US probably for a century, in places where that strike action was illegal, and for the most part they won. Like any union victory, the employers and the state have tried to unpick it since then, and things are drifting backwards. But at least on the face of it, in the first wave, they won their fights for the most part. So again, really the only tools that they used particularly was Facebook groups. Rise Up Retail is another example of where a worker organising project has used Facebook groups to great effect. And this one's really interesting because what happened here, this was when Toys R Us went bust. In the US, they weren't going to pay any redundancy pay, any severance pay. So people were just, losing their job, not having any money at all to see them through the next few weeks or months. They were losing their homes as a result, etc. Now, somebody had set up a Facebook group, and it grew to 15,000 workers very quickly. There was only 30,000 workers in Toys R Us in the US. So represented about 50% of the workforce. And then what Rise Up Retail did was they would use the search function on the Facebook group to search for people who had used keywords. So things like billionaires, things like Wall Street, things like, severance pay. So they could identify people who were concerned by the same issue and taking, I suppose, a progressive angle on it, were concerned about the power of the billionaires, the power of Wall Street, which had obviously destroyed their jobs and their company. And what they would do is using their personal Facebook profiles, okay, so they weren't using a page, they weren't using an organizational presence on Facebook, they were using their personal one. They would use direct messaging, Facebook Messenger, to reach out to those people. They would say, hey, I saw your post, it's really awful what's happened to you, how are you? Okay. And, not all of them would reply, but a lot of people would reply and say, well, I'm really bad right now. Here's what's happened for me. Here's my situation. It's really terrible. And what they did was they began the process of having a one-to-one, which traditionally we would do face-to-face, and they would do it online via Facebook Messenger, and they would move those people into a new Facebook group. They would say, they wouldn't jump in with a campaign pitch at first. This was very, very nuanced. And again, I can send you a link to a great webinar on this particular case study. They would have a long, deep conversation on there before they moved people into any kind of activity or recruitment. But having gone through that deep conversation, they would move people into another Facebook group. Through this campaign, they ended up winning $20 million in severance pay from the Wall Street financial houses that effectively had killed their company. So you started with these big regional Facebook groups. They then created closed and issue-based groups. They had identity-based groups as well, so for different demographics in the campaign. All of these as ways of organizing people and moving people. But again, like somebody mentioned earlier, very, very resource intensive. They didn't have a lot of staff, but they did have one staff person and a lot of volunteers who were, they would do, when somebody new joined a Facebook group, every one of them would get a welcome. They would keep an eye out for every time somebody joined that was in the same place as somebody else, and they would connect them together via Messenger and say, hey, you guys should chat, you're both in Texas, or something like this. So they were building that community very, very quickly. And then in terms of developing those people, they would have them take over. So they would then say, can you invite another friend? Have you got somebody else that you could get involved? The person would say, yes, I can get such and such. And then they would do the welcome for their friend. So gradually you started to develop people as taking responsibility for bringing new people in, for welcoming them, for showing them the way and guiding them. So you begin to distribute that out through different Facebook groups. So of online to offline organizing pathway looks something like this. They would reach out. Obviously later on, they would be moving people into action. They would be developing them as leadership. But the really key part is this blue bit here, connect. And this goes back a little bit to what was said earlier about WhatsApp groups and things like that. It was very, very intentional, as I say, that they were putting people together, getting people to meet people who lived in the same place or worked in the same store or had some kind of demographic commonality or anything like that. Anything where you could create a connection between people and build a community online, because that was what gave people the security and the strength to take the action that you wanted to take them later. So this became a real cyclical thing. So we've said online to offline, but actually it's really online to offline to online to offline to online to offline, etc. So you would basically see that by connecting into the online community, people would feel support, feel inspired. They would maybe see actions that had already happened. They would have the decision to take action. And by taking action, they would inspire more online activity, more people joining the Facebook group, more people talking about it, etc., etc. It became cyclical, very similar to XR's model there. They did 28 direct actions, 22 of which had no staff involvement. They had meetings with elected officials, with pension funds. They got a lot of mentions in local and national media. And as I say, they won $20 million in severance pay for Toys R Us workers. So those are some examples of using technology maybe in a way that can be a more dynamic way, a more large-scale organizing way. Why might it not work for unions? I'd be really interested again. What are your thoughts? Pop them in the chat box. What are the things that might stop this kind of thing working for unions? I mean, even the most recent case that I mentioned there, the Toys R Us case, those workers had very little to lose. they were leaving their company already. They had nothing to lose. So membership structure and data protection. Yeah, really, really good point. This is one of the things that really gets in the way. I think the data protection issue is sometimes overstated by unions, although it is super, super important. But there are ways of connecting people without breaking data protection law. But unions understandably are very, very cautious about this. Definitely though, the membership structure and just the actual approach to work with organising it can be really challenging. So obviously we have a membership structure in each union that is based around different industrial classifications, different sectors, something like that. We typically as organisers, because we follow that traditional model where it's based on identifying a structure and organising it, we typically work at quite a small scale. So even if we're working at a big scale, we'll just do it over many years. I spoke to a CW organiser recently who organised something that involved about 2,500 workers, but it took about 3 years. Very, very kind of slow process. When you're doing this kind of big organising, typically you can't tell where people are going to come from. So you can work at scale, but you can't necessarily say, well, we want them all to be in this same company. You can do it to some degree with your story, with your narrative, and saying who you want to organise. But there's a degree to which these two things rub up against each other. Just going to see what else we've got in there. Yeah, so actually resistance to change. Yeah, definitely. That's a real big one. And, you know, there's a problem here, which is that if you look at something like Extinction Rebellion and the Sunrise Movement, these organizations started afresh because they didn't try and change the existing green NGOs or organizations because they recognized that in itself could take 1,000,000 years. So they started new organizations. And, you know, I'm not suggesting that we start new unions necessarily, although there are, of course, some good examples in recent years of new unions, I think, leading the way, really. And it is super, super challenging to move these kind of agendas inside our big unions are like big tanker ships, right? They're hard to turn around, and we saw what happened to that tanker ship recently. So, you know, different unions, territoriality, and sticking to their base. I think this is another kind of key point here. Actually, most unions, or a lot of unions at the moment, are simply not looking to expand in this way, or in any way. In fact, are mostly, like, understandably trying to shore up their existing base and build density and infill organising in the places where they've already got a base. And you've also got this situation where, again, if a movement like this, something like this was going to happen, you would have different unions competing, obviously, for membership in some of the same sectors and industries, which in itself is an issue. The TUC doesn't play a major role here. So yeah, that's a problem. Connecting people on the ground can feel like a loss of control. Yeah, absolutely. And this is what's really, in the big organising space, ironically, yeah, this is really interesting because, you know, it comes back to how well you've done that DNA process, that process of setting out a story, structure and strategy, and the process of putting in place the training, coaching and resources to try and keep everything moving in the same direction, even though you're working at a scale where technically it is out of your control. Technically, everyone's autonomous, teams can do whatever they want. But by having something that's really clear, compelling, and convincing, people, you know, and even just a culture. So, I mean, one thing I didn't mention was XR obviously have a focus on what they call a regenerative culture. Some people might find this a little bit hippie, a little bit spiritual, etc. But the basic concept is that they've set in place a culture for their organization. They've said, you know, this is the way we work. This is how we look after each other. All of those things are in place to keep the whole thing moving in the same direction, which doesn't always work. But yeah, loss of control stops a lot of unions doing work at this scale. I said earlier that we come back to this one, leaders versus activists. Self-starting activists come on board through this kind of model. So the question is, can you turn them into organisers and have them engage organic leaders? That obviously is a challenge, but again, I would say something like the Red for Ed teacher strike have shown that it can work. Security has already been mentioned. Certainly, like Facebook groups, of course, ultimately managers could join, employers could join. You have to reach a balance of having that fast way of engaging and connecting people, but also putting up enough security. So you might use a tool like Telegram, which is more secure. People can't see each other's phone numbers. It's a bit like WhatsApp, but people can't see each other's phone numbers. But you're going to get less people on there. You're not going to get people on there as quick because everyone uses WhatsApp. So it's a new tool they need to download. So there needs to be a balance there. The last thing I'm going to say here is about hot shops. So people might have heard this phrase. This is where workers are pissed off with a particular issue. They come to the union, say they've got an issue, and typically union organisers steer clear of this. I think rightly. But the reason for that is that typically what happens is you end up doing casework rather than organising for the people that have got a live issue. And once the casework's complete, you don't often have a lot to show for it. You haven't necessarily built the union. You haven't necessarily developed activists through that. This model does turn that on its head, though, because this model says, well, we're not going to treat it as casework. People with a hot shop would, go through our organising process, go through our kind of action cycle, and begin taking action. And that's a very different approach to a hot shop. So actually, something that previously has not been a great thing for a union organiser to do might be a good thing at this point in this model. That's where I am going to stop. I realise that I might have spoken over my time, but hopefully it's been of some interest to folk. As I say, not fundamentally not about the technology per se, but about how you use it and what your organising approach is and things like that. So I'm going to stop there and hand back over to Phil to moderate things going on.
Yeah, thanks very much. And I mean, yeah, you did go over, but obviously that was extremely fascinating, that whole thing. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who's just like, there's so much more you could go into depth. We could probably have like a 10-hour meeting if we were like, if we were down the pub, talk about this endlessly. But I think obviously what we want to do now is try and encourage a bit more sort of discussion around this and what people think. I know people have been putting in the chat some of the thoughts already, but like I say, if you've got questions, either put your hand up to come in, or if you pop your question in the chat and we'll read them out, and then depending on how many people we get coming forward straight away, we'll either come back to Stu at intervals or answer each individual one. It depends sort of how keen people are, I suppose. So Tazy, hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. If you want to come in first.
Thanks. Hey, yeah, Tazy is exactly right. My pronouns are she, her. I work at the IWGB as the Digital and Operations Coordinator. I just wanted to give a shout out to a very cool bit of tech activism that the IWGB did recently that I think is like scalable and really interesting, which was called Deliveroo Unwrapped. So like a kind of play on like Spotify Unwrapped, when at the end of the year, Spotify tells you what you've listened to most that year. Basically, the way it worked is that Deliveroo riders upload their invoices to this platform, which is a very easy process. Like Deliveroo gives you invoices, you just upload them. And basically the scraper then analyzes them and gives the worker then a breakdown of this is what you were earning per hour. And that did three things for us. Did three things. It did, firstly, it's useful to the rider because it means that they get to like learn about their income and get angry about it. Secondly, it was really great for the union because it builds up a bank of people to then reach out to, recruit, activate. And thirdly, it was a massive plank of our campaign because we were gathering a huge amount of data about the reality of Deliveroo's pay. And that then basically was the bedrock of a report and a huge media splash that coincided with their IPO, which was a total disaster. So yeah, talk about disruptive tech. I've just pasted the link to the tool in the chat. It was yeah, like a really huge success and something we're looking to replicate.
No, thanks very much. I should probably mention as well, obviously Stu's mentioned a few things which I think we'll put links to when we upload this onto YouTube. We will put like in the description of the video, there will be all the links to everything that people might find useful. Obviously we'll include the that Deliveroo Unwrapped thing, because that sounds like, particularly in that sort of area, that sounds like a really useful model for something to take forward. While waiting for any other hands, Stu, anything you want to come back on that?
Just that's brilliant. I mean, that's exactly the kind of thing. And I think, what's really interesting is anything like that can engage workers and give workers a reason to get in contact with the organisation, to share stories and share experience and develop a sense of commonality with each other. You can see it all live there on the website. And again, I don't know how much the IWGB did this, but obviously if you've got this replication, absorption and replication strategy in place, you could be activating those people very, very quickly. One of the things that we found, you know, as I'm an organizer doing this work in the climate movement, is the speed at which you engage people into their first ask is really important. So actually, if somebody comes on board with something like that, asking them straight away, getting back to them within 24 hours, really, 48 hours tops, giving them the opportunity to go on the training and to get active is really, really important. If you wait a week, a month, you've lost those people. So, you know, but as a tool, as a way of engaging people, I saw it. I thought it was absolutely brilliant. What a great idea.
Cheers. Yeah, we've just had a comment in the chat about some of the biggest issues unions face about changing contact details for members, fail to update change of addresses, telephone numbers, etc. Which I think probably brings me on to one of the things that I kind of wanted to ask about this, because as you say, a lot of that stuff is based on like quite rapid turnaround. We're quite sort of cyclical, and I think obviously trade unions in general don't work like that. If you use the I think that analogy of the Ever Given is a really good one. But I mean, there is almost a balance sometimes, because we do want to move faster than we are, certainly. But I think there's also, particularly if you're organising in a particular employer, for example, obviously you're trying to get people to do stuff around the day job and around the work and stuff like that as well. So there's probably, I suppose, a balance, and plus you're not always doing it where you've got to lay some groundwork. There might not always be like that immediate issue that leaps to the fore and stuff like that. So I mean, just from your point of view, where do you see that? How do you see that balance? Leaving aside how we get unions to actually get on board with this in the first place, which I suppose is a separate question to ask, but where do you see that balance fall between those two things?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, the contact detail stuff. Yeah, I mean that's a nightmare at any type of organisation. I think like we partly, one of the things that's interesting here is that your social media tends not to change very often. So actually, if that is a means of communication, then it's a way we've always got. So if we can access you on Facebook Messenger, etc., that at least is a means of getting in touch with you to then say, is your address still the same or whatever. But I think in terms of the speed thing, I think it's what's important about it, I think, is to find the right balance of speed, momentum and satisfaction, I think, in different areas. So for example, if somebody says they want to get active fast, really fast, like 24, 48 hours, yeah. If we are trying to organize a site with 50 to 100 workers, we might be able to identify an issue very quickly, move, you know, and I think we see in like IWGB, UVW particularly, a very fast turnaround, or you know, there's stuff that goes on behind the scenes, but a relatively fast turnaround from people contacting the union to those people being out on strike. That happens very, very quickly because of the scale of it. Whereas if you're dealing with something like the NHS, for example, you know, whole different ballgame, right? So what you need to do in there is simply just break it down. So at any given moment, take something like the Red for Ed strike, they were able, partly because the level of activism and activity is so low in workplaces and in the workplaces, they were able to say, you know, 5 people, as I say, fronting up to a board of elected officials was as inspiring and as kind of cut through as Extinction Rebellion blocking the bridge or something like that. It is still stuff that really, really excited people and let people see it. So finding those actions that people can take in the workplace, so things like, you know, obviously like your t-shirt day, your button day, you know, these kind of things, stickering, or, you know, everybody sits down for 5 seconds at lunchtime, or whatever it is, any kind of creative thing that people can do. That doesn't mean they have to do loads of work outside of work, doesn't mean you know, that we have to have everyone. So it's almost like, again, it's like taking a historical problem like minority unionism and saying, what can we do with minority unionism, and turning it on its head. It's saying, well, if we can get a small number of people doing these things, but we have an absorption strategy via digital, then we can quickly scale it. So for example, at the moment, we're seeing small numbers of construction electrician workers taking action, blockading sites because of a threat to their terms and conditions. Small numbers, right? So we're seeing like maybe 5, 10, 15 workers taking these kind of actions, blockading sites. But what they could be doing is obviously having that absorption strategy where there would definitely be a lot more interest from other sparks and other electricians saying, hey, I saw you do that, you know, what can I do? And your first ask might not be, well, go and block a site. Your first ask might be something simple, like, can you get 5 colleagues to sign on, or can you, something kind of more practical and more simple in the workplace. So I think it's just combining those things. I will say, the NHS is an example, because we've got NHS Workers Say No in the UK, a fantastic online-driven campaign organisation. Frankly, the trade unions are find it hard to organise in the NHS and not super well organised. And they set up a Facebook group last year, which quickly went, it hit 50,000 members inside a week. It hit 85,000 members after a few weeks. So that side of it can scale very quickly. The task obviously then is to turn, to how you can bring those people in, whether you could use the thing from the Toys R Us campaign where they reach out individually to people and begin the online one-to-ones, so some combination of these things. It's hybridizing them, I suppose.
Well, wait, another one that's been put in the chat, which again I think is really relevant, is another issue is age. Younger members tend to rely on tech as a faster way to deliver and share info, as opposed to older members who prefer different methods. And I think that probably goes into activists as well, which is where if you're coming along and saying, right, here's all these great tech things we can use to build a union, and you've got a load of, I think most unions, and I know my own, the activists are on average older than the members, and particularly as you go higher up into the leadership. So that's a potential barrier there as well to all this. So I don't know if you've got thoughts on that point.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's both a problem and an opportunity, right? So on the one hand, obviously you're right that the activist space is older. One positive for me actually would be to flip that on its head and say, well, therefore, if we use these kind of tech models, we're going to engage a younger audience, and that's been a problem for us. That we haven't really been able to engage younger workers, that we haven't built a younger activist base. So maybe this is how we're going to do it. So just now and again, to organise one group of people sometimes can mean not organising another. And there is I'm not saying completely, but just say if we can put our focus onto a younger demographic through these models, then I don't see that as being a bad thing. Having said that, I think the other thing here is, again, coming back to that thing of unions typically, I mean, the Work Smart app, for example, will have cost a ton of money, a lot of work. They've created something bespoke. I'm not going to say whether it works on its own models or methods. I think most organisers will have an opinion on whether it works in an organising sense. But what's really interesting is most of these other campaigns that I'm talking about haven't done that. They haven't made bespoke technology. They haven't made things complicated. They've used tools that a lot of people use already. So even the fastest growing section of people on Facebook, we all know, is the older demographic, and actually the slowest growing use of Facebook is amongst the very youngest demographic, who are all on different social media platforms, because you don't want to be on the same thing as your parents, etc. So actually, if you're using things like Facebook, Google Docs, WhatsApp, most of these tools have a relatively low barrier to entry. The key thing for me, though, is that again, it's not about technology, it's about your organising and about your mobilisation and your momentum. Because in the organisation I work for, in my substantive role at the moment, for example, we have an older demographic amongst our activists, but we find them coming to use these tools because two things. One, the cause is so important, the cause is so motivating and so compelling and convincing that they will do whatever is necessary. I mean, if you can convince somebody to go on strike, you can definitely convince them to use WhatsApp. It's just coming at it with that same mentality of needing to show somebody. We provide training, we provide support, we do webinars, everything is there to help them develop new skills actually and find their way to use those tools. So I think if the motivation is there and the support is there, people can use them. It's when you just say, we're just going to move on to Slack, and you just say to everyone, just do it, and no one really knows why and really knows how, then of course you've got a problem. You're going to have a load of people fall off that. You're going to have a load of people just be annoyed by it. It's not going to fulfill what you wanted to fulfill. So I think, comes back to the story, the structure, and the strategy. Have you got that support in place, and the cause and the reason?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even with Zoom, I think that's one of those things. I know a lot of people are using it, but then a lot of other people are like, they're familiar with the type of technology, but they're using Teams at work, so that's the one they'll use. And then you try and get them to do another thing, and they say, "Oh no, that's not necessarily something that I want do, because I'm already have to do enough on bloody Teams without this. Yeah, so have we got any other questions? Anyone else want to come in at this point? Okay, Steve?
Yeah, I just think when we come to engaging those activists or those leaders that we currently have in our union that perhaps don't like the use of technology, one of the things that we need to recognise is there is a lot of digital poverty, and what unions need to do is invest in that. You know, our employers have done it. You know, our employers have invested to enable people like me to work from home for the last 14 months. And if I needed training on technology and communication skills online and things like that, they've put that into place. And I think, you know, if an employer can do it, then a union can do it. And, you know, just from the PCS perspective, having seen the annual report for finance this year, there was scope to invest in that because we didn't go over budget this year, and we actually went under budget. So, you know, a lot of the focus seems to be around, you know, enabling union full-time officials to work from home and this, that, and the other. But how are we going to engage our members if we don't deal with those kind of digital poverty and digital literacy issues? And, you know, there is a reticence for people changing the way that they've done things in the past. Now, the world keeps turning, and so our strategies need to turn as well. You know, we can't all go and sit in a pub and talk about how we're going to be trade union activists right now. I mean, in Wales, I don't think the pubs are open yet. But, you know, so that reticence to change, I think, is also quite damaging in a sense, because if you look at the PCS reports online at the minute, over the last 10 years, our membership numbers have plummeted. And one of the questions that it begs is, are we keeping up with the best ways of using what we have at our disposal? Technology isn't expensive for people. You know, I use Slack, Zoom, Teams, Discord and things, and I don't pay for a single one of them. And so, you know, perhaps we need to tap more into that and train people effectively.
I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think that investment just hasn't really been there, both in terms of money, time, and capacity. You know, it's really interesting right now. If you go on union job sites over in the United States, you will see it's really common now to have job adverts for what they would call a digital to field organizer or an online to offline organizer as a specific role and specific skill set. And we just don't really have that in the UK. We have digital teams in our unions, and there's actually good research now in progressive activism to show that a digital team itself is a problem where it's siloed off. But over in the US, it's much more common now to have, as I say, kind of digital to field as a thing. And their investment will be in obviously not only identifying the tools that people can use or that we could hopefully encourage people to use, but again, yeah, the training, the support for people. The other thing, you're absolutely right about digital poverty. And I mean, obviously we've seen, you know, the flip side of people discovering new technology during the coronavirus crisis has also been the number of kids that have really struggled to access education because they don't have internet at home or they don't have the right number of devices for the brothers and sisters and all the rest of it. And this for me strikes another thing, which is not only about our investment in the tech for our members, but it is also about the campaign issues that we work on, and the fact that, you know, this is a different discussion, but in some ways it's related because it comes back to that thing about what you do about self-starters versus organic leaders, is thinking from a whole worker organizing or whole person organizing perspective. There are plenty of issues which affect our members which are not workplace specific. The digital divide and digital poverty is, of course, a really obvious one. You know, there's housing, there's climate change, there's all these other kind of things, which if unions were taking those up and building workers' movements in the community as well as in the workplace, in the streets, all these other things, we could use these tools to engage a much bigger demographic of people, whole load of new members, and then move their activity into the workplace and do that. So that would be interesting as well. But no, you're quite right. The only other thing I'd say is, of course, again, it comes back to the consumer tech thing. You're right. We don't pay for most of these tools. There are free versions which are perfectly good enough for the work that we want to do, and typically we end up paying for things that we don't need to, I think. and it's finding the right tools for the right demographics. I know that when I was organising with Acorn, we used Facebook a lot because the demographic that we were working with tended to be on Facebook, but then we realised, frankly, that initially the organisation was a very white organisation. We knew that we had to rectify that, and we found that where we were based in the city we were based in, there's a large Somali population, and WhatsApp was the tool of choice for the Somali community there. So we had to, we had to learn, and we had to move and adjust, and we moved on to WhatsApp. And it's not the only thing we did. We did a bunch of other things, but we did engage a big Somali base as well. So, yeah, it's absolutely, every organizer says, come to people where they are, and that's absolutely true online as well.
So, I mean, one of the things I've just been thinking about more as you were talking is in much the same way that so when we were organising the workplace face-to-face, there's a lot of the stuff that we do, the employer and businesses do as well. They're also identifying leaders. They're for different reasons, but they're doing it. And this is something I think is true online as well. Like a lot of the stuff you were talking about in terms of how the campaigns were being built. You talking about things like building a community, engagement with people, calls to action, and stuff like that. And a lot of the stuff where people who are, whether they're people making YouTube videos or doing whatever social media and all these sorts of things, it's all obviously for different reasons, and it's different things they're asking people to do, but it's built around that same model. And it's almost like obviously someone doing that reaches like millions and millions of people, whereas if you look at like a video the trade union puts out, and it's like if you get a couple of hundred, it's seen as quite good engagement and that sort of thing. So I suppose the question there is, to what extent I suppose the offset of that would be seeing trade union leaders trying to like emulate YouTube personalities would be so cringeworthy. But to what extent is there stuff that we can learn from that, or is that something we should? I mean, what do you think on that?
I think definitely, and you're right. I think ultimately the thing here is, of course you get lucky occasionally. You have a trade union or a political leader who is good at that kind of work, and obviously in the US things like the movement around Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez shows how a kind of politician or a leader of some kind of institutional leader can use that stuff. But frankly, it's pretty rare. And the stuff that flies better, if you don't have that kind of personality, the stuff that flies better is just real stories and real people. And I think that there's a weird thing where even when we say we're going to do this, it typically doesn't work that well. We say we're going to platform workers, we're going to tell workers stories, but it's always in quite a contrived way. We have a page on our website, we have a snazzy photo of a worker, and they're kind of stuffing quotes, and it's that kind of stuff. Whereas what we're talking about from these movements is a much more grassroots approach. Things don't look perfect, things aren't spelled perfect, they're not it's clearly not slick, it's clearly not contrived. Actually, sometimes it is behind the scenes, but there's a real focus on platforming workers, and that comes across in the actions as well. When we send out some of the information after this, one of the case studies looking at the Toys R Us campaign that I mentioned was their actions. They would do this thing that first happened at the Occupy movement, where they would have, let's say, 50 workers or something, occupy a site, go into a Toys R Us store or something like that, and everyone would have something to say. It would all be well planned out in advance, but the people would have very, very emotional, personal testimony to give, and to really amplify it literally in the space. Every 3 or 4 words, every sentence would be repeated by the crowd, so the people at the back could hear it, and it really raises it up. But it works very well in that space. But what it also does is make a really compelling thing for social media. A really compelling thing to share around. You've got this thing that is very emotional in its own merits, but is also being built up by the collective action of the people being there and saying it together and saying these words together. And it has a really interesting dynamic to it. So that's one thing. I also think like a young lad who's come out of the climate school strike movement, Joe Brindle, wrote a piece recently. He either runs or has been involved with Teach the Future, a great campaign around climate in education. He wrote a piece recently about using Reddit. Reddit, for people who don't know, is a kind of forum website. If you're familiar with forums, it's like a messaging website. But the interesting thing about Reddit is that there's a kind of culture in that space. And again, you need to know the culture of that space. He goes into it very well. The organizations basically are not welcome. Promotion is basically not welcome. You won't get any engagement for that kind of thing. So even sharing a petition or sharing something like that won't go anywhere. Whereas if you engage as an individual and do it in the right way, you can build a massive following. There are people on there. There's one person in particular who runs some of the Bernie Sanders and AOC groups in there who have literally hundreds of thousands of followers just because of the way they've engaged as an individual. Joe did an experiment looking to engage young people in the climate strikes. And again, we'll send it out afterwards, but it's a fascinating insight into how to make it work, because it did work. And he saw thousands of people signing up for the strikes in a clever way. So yeah, it does come back to, I think, if you either finding the individuals who are good influencers, who do carry, and ultimately these are the same people that we want as leaders in the workplace. Often they're people that are charismatic, that are influential, that people look to with and feel confident in, etc. If we can find those people for this work, then great. But if we can't, just that emotional personal testimony and having it be shared in a way that shows the dynamism and collectivity of our movement.
I think if there's, I suppose, three things people can take away from this today, they can do either as an individual or within their own organizations to try and get more of this stuff happening in a better way. From your point of view, what would those two things be? And then obviously any other concluding remarks you want to make?
I think the things I would take away from it is actually to come back to the way of using technology and think about the type of stuff that we spoke about, the social movements doing, the DNA work, the story, strategy, and structure. You can apply that to even a local campaign. Obviously, there's a degree to which the scale itself is important. If 10% of people who see it get involved, and you've only reached 100 in the first place versus 10,000 in the first place, that's going to make a difference. But every union organising drive has its degree of building momentum, of seeing people take action, and then using that as a way to engage more people. So I think, come back to that, come back to what that story, structure, and strategy could be applied in your local campaigns, and then think about what technology that we've talked about, and again, it will go out after this in the links and stuff, could be used to do that. So, again, free tech. Can you set up a Google form so that when people see your action, you spread it on your social media? There's a Google form that people fill in, that sends you an email, and you're on the phone to them within an hour. Can you do that? What would you need to do that? You would obviously need the Google form, but you would also need 10 people in your branch to be ready to be phone bankers, say. So it's also, it's that capacity set up in the first place, and saying, and what's the sequencing? So yeah, first thing, use the DNA, the story, structure, strategy in your local campaigns. Then think about what tools and tech you need, and then think about what the sequence is of needing volunteers to support the work, and ask people in your branch to do it. I think we could see some interesting results there.
Yeah. So okay. Well, like I say, thanks very much for taking the time to talk to us today, and thanks everyone for coming along. This has been, I think I probably speak for everyone when I say that a lot of this has been really interesting and really interesting presentation and discussion. So just to very quickly mention to everyone, again, just this will be on YouTube afterwards for people to be able to share it and hopefully get more people talking about this, because I think this is something that we do need to talk a lot more about in the trade union movements in general, and get hopefully obviously build from talking about it to actually doing it and using it. And then other than that, just if anyone, I know people are here from a variety of organisations, but anyone from PCS who's not already involved, if you look up the PCS Rank File Network, like I say, one of the things we are trying to do on a regular basis is to encourage more workers to talk about organising, and organising in a way that's directly connected to the workplace, that actually directly engages workers and isn't just about going through the motions in terms of formal bureaucracy. It's about building something on the ground. But yeah, again, thanks very much everyone for taking the time, and hopefully any future talks we'll do, see you with them as well.